All right, welcome in everyone. We're ready to kick off another deep dive, and today we're going to be wading into some pretty murky waters. It's a story about power, about the Justice Department, and about just how independent our legal system really is.
Yeah, I think this story really highlights some of the tensions that are always present in our system of government. It's a fascinating case study for sure.
It is, and the main source for our deep dive today is a pretty explosive report from name of publication. This report alleges that President Trump personally ordered the firing of over a dozen prosecutors, and get this, they all had previously worked under former Special Counsel Jack Smith.
Now, that's where things get really interesting. This isn't just a case of routine personnel changes. This could indicate a shift towards what's called the unitary executive model of governance.
Unitary executive. Now, that's a term that some folks might not be familiar with. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Sure. The unitary executive theory essentially argues for a much stronger concentration of power in the hands of the president, so it gives them greater control over all executive agencies. And yeah, that includes those agencies that are traditionally considered independent, like the Justice Department.
Okay, so we're talking about a situation where the president could potentially have more direct authority over how the Justice Department operates, even when it comes to, say, sensitive investigations.
Exactly. And that raises some serious questions about whether the Justice Department could really maintain its impartiality, especially if it's seen as being under the direct control of the White House.
And this report really lays out a very specific sequence of events. It starts with President Trump expressing his desire to see these particular prosecutors removed from their positions.
Right. And the report then details how the White House Personnel Office, led by Sergio Gore, who, by the way, is a known Trump ally, issued a memo to the Justice Department. This memo instructed them to go ahead with the terminations.
So there you have it. It's like a direct line from the White House to the Justice Department, leading to the acting attorney general sending out formal termination notices.
And it's important to remember that we're not just talking about nameless, faceless bureaucrats here. We're talking about career prosecutors, people with years of experience, people with a deep understanding of the legal system.
And to be even more specific, these were prosecutors who were part of Jack Smith's team, the very team that was investigating potential wrongdoing by President Trump himself.
Right. And that raises a big question. What message does this send to other Justice Department employees? Are they going to feel pressured to make decisions that align with the White House, even if it might compromise their own professional judgment? Or even, potentially compromise the pursuit of justice itself?
It's a chilling thought. And as if things weren't already complicated enough, this report reveals that these fired prosecutors might actually find themselves under investigation now.
Yeah, that's right. Remember that executive order that President Trump signed? The one that established an investigation into the so-called weaponization of the federal government? Well, it seems very likely that these fired prosecutors will be a key focus of that investigation.
Hold on. So let me get this straight. The very people who are investigating potential abuses of power are now facing scrutiny themselves in a politically charged investigation initiated by the very person they were initially investigating.
You got it. The irony is pretty thick, isn't it? It just adds another layer of complexity to this whole tangled web of power dynamics and legal maneuvering.
The report actually goes into the backgrounds of some of these prosecutors, and it's a good reminder that these aren't just abstract legal positions we're talking about. These are real people, many with families, established careers, and all of a sudden they're thrust into this chaotic situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Amidst all the legal wrangling and the political maneuvering, it's important to remember the human cost here. These firings represent a disruption of lives and livelihoods, adding a layer of personal tragedy to this already complex story.
So we've established that these firings were unusual, probably even unprecedented, and we've talked about the potential implications for the Justice Department's independence. But you mentioned earlier that these prosecutors had something called civil service protections. So shouldn't those protections have shielded them from this kind of politically motivated dismissal?
Yeah, you're right to bring that up. In theory, those protections should prevent exactly this type of situation. It's supposed to be a shield against unfair or arbitrary dismissal.
So then why didn't those protections prevent these firings? What happened?
Well, even though those protections are there to safeguard against political interference, they're not always foolproof. There are loopholes. There are exceptions. And, how those protections were applied, or maybe even how they were circumvented, is going to be a subject of a lot of scrutiny and debate as this story continues to unfold.
So it sounds like navigating these civil service protections is kind of like walking through a legal minefield. But let's step back for a second and look at the broader picture here. This isn't just an isolated incident, is it? It seems like these firings are part of a much bigger pattern of upheaval within the Justice Department.
Yeah, you're definitely onto something there. The report points out that these dismissals are really just one piece of a much larger puzzle. If you look at the early days of President Trump's second term, there's been a lot of turbulence in the Justice Department. High-ranking officials have been demoted or pushed out of key divisions, like the criminal division, the civil division, the national security division. They've all seen major shakeups.
So it's not just about getting rid of specific individuals. It sounds like it's more about a complete overhaul of the department's leadership.
It does seem that way, right? Like a very strategic restructuring is underway. And the expectation is that once these, well, let's just call them vacancies, are created, they'll be filled with lawyers who have a demonstrated history of loyalty to President Trump.
Okay, so the strategy seems to be remove those who are perceived as disloyal and replace them with those who share the president's views. It sounds pretty straightforward on the surface, but what's the ultimate objective here? I mean, what's the end game?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The report suggests that President Trump's team really envisions a Justice Department that actively works to enforce the president's wishes, enact his political agenda, so to speak. It's a vision where the line between, say, law enforcement and political maneuvering becomes increasingly blurry.
Right, and if we connect that back to our earlier discussion about the unitary executive theory, it paints a pretty unsettling picture. They're essentially trying to transform the Justice Department into an arm of the White House, a tool to be used for political purposes.
Yeah, it definitely represents a significant departure from how we've traditionally viewed the Justice Department, as this independent entity that's dedicated to upholding the rule of law, no matter what the political considerations might be.
And what about the potential long-term consequences of this power play? We talked about the impact on individual prosecutors, but what about the institution itself? What happens to the Justice Department?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Imagine you're a Justice Department employee and you've seen these firings firsthand. How do you think that's going to affect your own decision-making?
Well, I imagine it would create a lot of fear and uncertainty. You'd be constantly looking over your shoulder, wondering if your next decision might put you in the crosshairs.
Exactly. There's a real possibility that this whole situation could have a chilling effect on the morale and independence of the remaining Justice Department employees.
Yeah.
I mean, if they see their colleagues being dismissed for not towing the line, they might be less likely to speak up or pursue investigations that could be perceived as going against the White House.
So it creates a culture of fear and self-censorship within the very institution that's supposed to be upholding justice and accountability.
It's a disturbing thought.
Right.
And the implications of this go way beyond the Justice Department itself. If the public starts to believe that the department is just a puppet of the White House, it erodes trust in the entire legal system.
It all sounds pretty bleak. Is there any potential upside here? Is there any hope that this power grab can be checked or reversed?
Well, as concerning as this situation is, it's important to remember that things are still developing. There are some potential avenues for pushback and accountability. For instance, there could be legal challenges to the firings. Some of the dismissed prosecutors might argue that their dismissals were politically motivated and therefore illegal.
So the courts could potentially step in and rein in this power grab.
Absolutely. The courts have a crucial role to play here. They need to uphold the rule of law and ensure that the Justice Department operates within its constitutional limits. And don't forget about Congress.
Right. Congress has oversight responsibilities when it comes to the executive branch. So they could investigate these firings, hold hearings, maybe even pass legislation to try and strengthen the Justice Department's independence.
Exactly. Congressional oversight is a vital check on executive power. And in a situation like this, where there are very serious concerns about potential abuses of power, it's really crucial that Congress uses its oversight authority to the fullest extent.
So there's still a chance that this power play could be stopped, that the Justice Department can regain its independence, and that the rule of law will prevail.
There's always a chance.
Mm-hmm.
But it's going to take vigilance and pushback from a lot of different fronts. The courts, Congress, and most importantly, the American people.
Yeah.
We all have a stake in making sure that the Justice Department can function as a truly independent and impartial arbiter of justice.
You know, this whole deep dive has really opened my eyes to how complex our legal system is and how vulnerable it can be. It's a stark reminder that the fight for justice never really ends, does it? It requires constant vigilance, a commitment to holding those in power accountable. It's easy to get caught up in all the legal stuff and the political back and forth, but really this whole situation comes down to a very basic question about power, and accountability.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This isn't just some theoretical legal debate. This is about the very principles that our democracy is built on. It's about whether the people in power are actually subject to the same laws as everyone else, or whether they can just use their authority to avoid any kind of scrutiny.
This report has really given us a lot to think about, that's for sure. But one question keeps coming back to me. What safeguards are left, to ensure fairness and impartiality in the legal system if the Justice Department really does become just an extension of the White House?
That is the question, isn't it? It's a question that I think every American should be asking themselves right now. If the Justice Department loses its independence, what what recourse do ordinary citizens have, if there are abuses of power?
It's like something out of a dystopian novel, right? Where the line between law enforcement and political persecution just becomes completely blurred.
The stakes are incredibly high.
Right.
We're talking about the very foundation of our legal system, the idea that everyone is equal before the law. If that principle is eroded, the consequences could be devastating.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this, but I think it's important to remember that we as citizens have a role to play in protecting our institutions.
I couldn't agree more. This isn't just something we can sit back and watch unfold. We can't just be passive observers while the foundations of our democracy are potentially being undermined. We need to have these discussions.
Yeah.
That we need to demand transparency from our elected officials and hold them accountable for their actions.
So what can we actually do? What are some concrete steps that people can take to make a difference?
Well, for one thing, we need to stay informed, read critically, have these discussions. Don't be afraid to ask tough questions. Contact your representatives and let them know that you're paying attention, that you expect them to uphold the principles of justice and accountability.
And it's important to support those organizations that are out there fighting to protect civil liberties and defend the rule of law. They're on the front lines of this battle, and they need our support now more than ever.
Absolutely. We need to be active citizens, not passive bystanders. We need to make our voices heard and demand a system of justice that is impartial and accessible to everyone.
Well, this deep dive has certainly been eye-opening. We've explored the potential consequences of this power shift within the Justice Department, and we've talked about the role that we as citizens have to play in protecting the integrity of our legal system.
And this story is far from over. It's something that we'll continue to follow closely, and we encourage everyone listening to do the same. Stay engaged, stay informed, stay vigilant. The future of justice in America really might depend on it.
That's all for today's deep dive. We hope this conversation has given you something to think about and maybe even inspired you to get involved. The fight for justice is a constant one. It requires all of us to participate if we want to ensure a better future for ourselves and for generations to come.